Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Jewish Policy Center webinar. I'm Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC, and your host. Before we get to our guest, David Schenker, here is your JPC commercial. We are now into our second year of webinar programming, and I'm really pleased to see the sign-up list continuing to grow. But more important, I am so happy to see so many of you coming back for 2 or 3 or 17 speakers. I know how much I have learned from this series. I hope you're learning as well. The JPC was established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can sign up for our Insight articles and our magazine In Focus. The spring issue of In Focus has just come out with our priorities for Congress and the administration. We think there are some issues that need addressing. First on our list is the essay on political polarization and how the founding fathers addressed what they saw as shortcomings in human nature and the shortcomings of political parties. Thomas Jefferson in particular believed political parties were a curse. Okay, take a look. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. And we strongly support not telling the New York Times about Israel's military activities in the region, as a certain administration recently did. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. We've been pleased to bring you scholars and policy makers on such issues as China, including a very important one on Israel's relations with China, which you can find on our website, the Abraham Accords, Iran sanctions, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, American defense, and how to address domestic terrorism. We're back to the Middle East today. Our speaker last week, Simon Ledeen, focused largely on the Persian Gulf and Iranian aggression in the areas to the south of Israel. Today, we're going to look at other countries and other problems because there is simply no end to other problems. Now your public service announcement. You are muted, but you can send your questions during the program to us using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Today's speaker is David Schenker. There are very few people in Washington about whom I say this is a really, really smart person, but I say it about David Schenker, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, where he was the principal Middle East advisor to the Secretary of State, and was the senior official overseeing the conduct of U.S. policy and diplomacy in a region that stretched from Morocco to Iran to Yemen, and responsibility for 18 countries, the Palestinian Authority, and Western Sahara. I told you, big space, big problems. Through diplomacy and effective allocation of resources and assistance, as well as through sanctions, David worked to promote human rights, deter terrorism, fight corruption, and push back against regional adversaries. In addition to developing and implementing U.S. strategy on China in the region, he worked to heal the Gulf Rift between Qatar and its neighbors, resolve the conflicts in Libya and Yemen, consolidate the Abraham Accords, and counter malign Iranian influence in the region. It was a small job, right? No, it was a huge, it may be the biggest job in all of government. This is his second stint in government from 2002 to 2006. David served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as Levant Country Director, the Pentagon's top policy aide on Arab nations and the Levant. He was awarded the Defense Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service in 2005. David has now returned to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he is a senior fellow. Previously at the Institute, he was director of the program on Arab politics, where he wrote prolifically about Jordan, Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Egypt, among other things. His writing on Arab affairs have appeared everywhere you think they should, including scholarly journals, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and the Jerusalem Post. I am very honored today to present David Schenker. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Shoshana, and thank you to the Jewish Policy Center Board of Trustees for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm sure that everyone's following closely what's going on with Israel, the inconclusive elections, the amazing vaccine rollout and the reopening of society, as well as the concerning restart of the negotiations with Iran about the JCPOA. It's still very early, but there's already a lot of confusion as to what we're hearing from the administration about what the objective is. For some officials, I think Secretary Blinken, we've been told that the administration seeks a longer and stronger deal. From Rob Malley, we've heard that we're looking for compliance with the original 2015 deal. And President Biden himself says that there must be negotiations and discussions about Iran's regional behavior, especially its support for so many regionally destabilizing militias, that's got to be on the table as well. I know that the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration did not succeed in compelling Iran to return to the negotiating table, but my view is that it did succeed in generating a significant amount of economic pressure on the regime in Tehran. And that pressure should not be given away. It should be leveraged to try and get a better deal, one that encompasses not only the nuclear file, but the development and proliferation of advanced ballistic missiles and the regional behavior. And the administration should not be pursuing Iran. This dynamic where the US wants a deal more than the Iranians ended badly last time. Iranian elections, for example, should not increase the sense of urgency for Washington to get a deal. It's not between moderates and so-called hardliners. It's between hardliners and harderliners. I would argue that from Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, Iran is now pursuing its own maximum pressure campaign against Washington, trying to compel the US to move quickly to a deal, but we should not accede to this pressure. Finally, the administration should be talking with all its regional partners about what they would like to see in a deal. After all, the deal potentially will affect our friends in the Middle East the most. I don't get the impression that much of this has been happening yet. I am pleased, however, that Yossi Cohen is reportedly headed to Washington today to discuss these issues, which is a good start. To be sure, there's a lot more to say about the Israel-Iran dynamic, including about the Savitz attack yesterday and the reported shipping war that you referred to, Shoshana. But I wanted to leave time to talk a little bit about some developments in important regional states. Jordan's been in the headlines a lot since April 3rd, when the king's half-brother Hamza, the son of King Hussein, and former minister Bassem al-Abdallah and several tribesmen were arrested for reportedly engineering a coup. This was, I think, a tempest in a teacup, a family feud that was, for the time being, or has for the time being, been resolved. Hamza has apologized and pledged fealty, and al-Abdallah has reportedly been returned to Saudi Arabia, although that is still in question. At the heart of the matter is Hamza's seeming non-acceptance of his demotion in 2004 when he was removed by King Abdullah as crown prince in favor of his own son, Hussein. The same thing happened, by the way, with Hassan, King Hussein's brother, but he accepted it and eventually moved on. So I think this is likely to be a blip on the radar, but what Hassan talked about, the corruption, inequality, and the troubled economy of the kingdom, they are real problems that persist. Jordan has a very high debt to GDP ratio, 90-something%. It's running a recurrent deficit of $2 billion a year out of a $12 billion annual budget. It has a Chinese debt trap in Adarat, a huge power plant that is costing the kingdom hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Youth unemployment is about 40%. The kingdom has the lowest female workforce participation, among the lowest in the world, and it's got a public sector which still employs a plurality of Jordanian citizens. These problems, if not addressed, will ultimately lead to radicalization at home and potentially instability. And the problem here is not dissent, like Hamza was articulating. And the answer is not to shut down Clubhouse or other social media. The answer is really painstaking economic reform. We'll see if they're ever able to get around to that. And just a quick word about the spat between Jordan and Israel over Hussein's aborted visit to the Temple Mount and Jordan's refusal to grant overflight to Netanyahu's travel to the UAE. This is incredibly unproductive and dangerous, and it's been going on for far too long. Yes, Jordan has been too reticent and publicly normalized with Israel, but Israel too has taken Jordan for granted, reneging on commitments such as the Red Dead, which don't inspire mutual confidence. The strategic relationship remains excellent, but more has to be done to build out the relationship, and it's going to take an effort from both sides. On to Lebanon. Since the August 2020 explosion at Beirut port, Lebanon has spiraled downward toward financial collapse. The blast was the coup de grace for Lebanon's already teetering economy, triggered massive devaluation, hyperinflation, a spike in unemployment, and in the absence of a functioning port, which handled 80% of Lebanon's import, there's been a critical shortage of consumer goods. Meanwhile, there's been no government since the last one resigned a few days after the port bombing or blast. And Lebanese politicians continue to jockey for power. Today, as I think I've said before, some 50% of Lebanese are below the poverty line, 25% of them are destitute. The central bank has no reserves. People can't get money out of the bank. They can't afford food. And the lira, which once was pegged to 1,500 to $1, is now 15,000 to $1. It's a sinking ship, but Hezbollah, buoyed by Iranian funding, which I fear will increase if Tehran once again starts to receive pallets of cash from Washington after a nuclear deal. Hezbollah is still better off than any of the other particular groups in the country, and they're feeling their oats. During the JCPOA, Iranian proxies had carte blanche to do as they wished throughout the region. The Obama administration didn't go after the proxies of Iran for fear of scuttling the deal. When I was assistant secretary for NEA, we sanctioned Hezbollah and its allies in Lebanon and engaged with brave Shiite dissidents who courageously articulated their views about how Hezbollah was destroying the country. Just 3 weeks after the Biden administration took office, Hezbollah assassinated one of those Shiites, a guy named Lokman Slim, who was a US government aid grantee, a USAID grantee, who I knew for 20 years and who I met with twice during my time in office. It was a good friend. This is an unmistakable challenge to the Biden administration. Now, Israel continues to target advanced Iranian missiles and weapon systems in Syria, some of which are en route to Hezbollah in Lebanon, but some of these systems invariably get through, and Hezbollah continues apace in its project to upgrade its 150,000 dumb rockets to precision-guided munitions. So every day, Hezbollah's capabilities are improving, as are the chances, as I see it, for another costly war between Hezbollah and Israel. At the same time, the currency devaluation in Lebanon is having a real impact on the morale of the Lebanese armed forces, which have seen their salaries reduced by 90% due to the currency devaluation. Now, the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, is no panacea, but in terms of public order, it's a critical institution. The US has backed $246 million World Bank social safety net program to feed something like 180,000 Lebanese families for a year. That's a good humanitarian gesture. I'm pretty confident that the Biden administration will continue to pursue the last administration's policy of not backing an IMF loan until a new government undertakes real and enduring reforms. No one, in my view, should be allowed to rebuild the port without reforms and until there's a mechanism in place to ensure that Beirut port doesn't once again become an asset for Hezbollah. Notwithstanding negotiations with Iran, I also hope the Biden administration continues the policy of designating Hezbollah and its allies, raising the cost for those who truck with Hezbollah. Finally, I wanted to say a few words about Iraq. Yesterday, Washington and Baghdad conducted their third strategic dialogue. The headline of the meeting from the joint communique issued afterwards was that the US and coalition forces mission had now, quote unquote, transitioned to one focused on training and advisory tasks, thereby allowing for redeployment of any remaining combat forces in Iraq. Now, I was in the first two strategic dialogues with Iraq, and I can tell you that the language of this communique matters greatly to both sides. The Iraqi government is under tremendous pressure from the 100,000 strong Hashd-e-Shabi, the Iranian-backed Shiite militias there. They're under pressure to drive the US out of the country. But the Iraqi political class understands that if the US leaves, like it did during the Obama administration in 2011, it would all but guarantee the resurgence of ISIS. There is no so-called coalition without US troops and without US capabilities. Likewise, as we learned in December 2019, our diplomatic presence is to an extent dependent on having some military capabilities in Iraq. We cannot count on the Iraqi government, despite some efforts, to protect our people there. So the communique once again threaded the needle. Several key Iraqi politicians came out in support of the communique and the dialogue. Hadi al-Amri, surprisingly, Haidar Abadi and Ammar al-Hakim. Not surprisingly, the Iranian-backed militias rejected the communique even before it had been published. But the long and short of it is that we will likely have some important capabilities in Iraq for the foreseeable future. As for the economy and the politics of Iraq, the bad news continues. There are no reliable statistics, COVID statistics for Iraq, but the situation is bad and the economy is in terrible shape. So much so that Baghdad has not met its obligations, its financial obligations to the Kurdish regional government for some time. And like Lebanon, Iraq remains one of the most corrupt countries on earth. The continued relationship with the United States, as opposed to Iran, is one that provides some degree of confidence in Iraq, some hope for Western foreign direct investment, and the potential for going forward with some assistance from international financial institutions. Meanwhile, since January 20th, these Iranian-backed militias have increased operational tempo of their attacks against US personnel in Iraq. During the last administration, we purchased a degree or a respite from attacks by warning the Iranians that we would hold them directly responsible if an American was killed in Iraq. The Iranians understand that that particular threat is no longer valid. For his part, Prime Minister Khatami has taken some steps to protect American personnel, making arrests of Iranian-backed militiamen. But there's always a concern that if he goes too far, these militias will target him, and they did so before. Unfortunately, Khatami recently announced that he will not run in the upcoming Iraqi elections. So it's going to be a real challenge to find an Iraqi politician or prime minister who's going to try and exert Iraqi sovereignty and maintain Iraq within the sort of 40-yard lines of the US-Iranian football pitch. The bottom line, though, is that the continued US presence in Iraq is critical if we hope to contest the space with Iran. It's not only about the United States. Iran has used Iraq to target Saudi Arabia, and Iran is storing ballistic missiles, likely intended for Israel, in Iraq. So if we leave Iraq, this will be bad for our position in the region, especially in Syria, and we will award Iran with an uncontested line of communication to Lebanon. So this is just a few brief comments of overview. I'm happy to talk to you about whatever you'd like to talk about, and look forward to the discussion. So thanks, Shoshana, again.
David, thank you very much. We have questions. The first question is actually going to be mine, and it will be a weird one. If you look north of Israel and you look at the arc of Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, why would anybody look to those things for positive influences, which leads to the real question, which is when the Palestinians look, as they're going to have an election of a sort, perhaps, maybe, it's hard for me to imagine anybody in the Palestinian territories voting for anybody who thinks that Syria or Lebanon or even Jordan or Iraq is a good model. And won't they look at the Abraham Accords and see economic advancement, political future for their kids, things that look entirely more optimistic than the North? Could we be coming to a tipping point?
Well, that's a good question, Shoshana. It's not a weird question. Listen, you have competing models in the region, right? You have the Iranian model, which is that the Iranians have relationships in these countries. They establish militia over time. In the case of Hezbollah, it took 30 years. Now they dominate the country and they prevent this country from developing and contribute greatly to the corruption there and the intimidation, the lack of the type of freedoms that the average Lebanese embraced and this pro-West orientation of the country. They changed it around. In Syria, right, with Iranian assistance, you've had what resembles a genocide. Some 500,000, mostly Syrian Sunni Muslims who have been killed and driven into exile. And then, of course, in Iraq, where in a quicker way, the Iranians established after the arrival of ISIS, this 100,000 strong Iraqi Shiite-backed militia there that now does whatever it would want to do outside the control of the government, undermining confidence in the government, preventing sovereignty, and contributing once again to the economic downfall of this country. You would think that the Palestinians would look around and understand that there is a great chance for economic development and prosperity, if less than a state with a military, then perhaps an entity or someday a state that has police or militarized police, but that's the extent of it, and say, we can have prosperity for our people. There are $10 billion of Emirati money that is looking to do perhaps joint projects with the Jordanians, with the Palestinians, with Israelis, and say we can be a prosperous place. Our kids can do well, and see this as the proper model. And yet we do know that it's not just Gaza, where there is predominance of Hamas, right? Hamas is present in the West Bank as well. And part of this is a problem of Fatah misrule, the ruling class of Palestinian politics being dominated by a corrupt, capricious, violent, repressive, political party, where you have a president who's going into the 13th or 14th year of a 6-year term and shows no willingness to diversify centers of power, nor to advocate for the economic improvement of the people who live there. I hope that the Palestinians will vote in what we would hope would be their interests, and that they see as their interests. But I'm not at all confident that they will. I don't know who's going to win. I can't predict the past. Certainly not going to predict the future. But you could have a redux of 2006. I had great confidence in the Palestinian people in 2006. They would make good choices, and I was wrong. We don't know how it's going to turn out.
Okay, I'm going to run a couple of questions together from listeners having to do with China. First of all, the question is whether China is helping Iran to evade sanctions. It also seems that China is expanding its relations in the Gulf beyond Iran. And third, can you talk about the Haifa port agreement with China and how that impacts upon Israel's relationship with the United States regarding the Haifa port and the presence occasionally of the US Navy? So it's a China question and an America question. Okay, so is China helping Iran to evade sanctions? Yes. During the prior administration, we sanctioned Chinese companies. I would hope that the Biden administration does so as well, as long as these sanctions remain in place and they're applicable. I don't see any reason why China would get a free pass here. Second, is China expanding Gulf relations? I spent probably about a quarter of my time when I was Assistant Secretary for NEA working on China-related issues, and talking to our friends and allies in the Gulf, in Israel, North Africa, about the relationship with China. Now, you want to have a strategic relationship with Washington. It's very hard to do so if the backbone of your communications network is Huawei, right? All communications are compromised. But it goes beyond that. Working with China in AI, working with China, for example, if they're doing your COVID testing, then everybody in your country, their DNA becomes property of the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party. This is not like Google that refuses to open phone, or Apple that refuses to open your iPhone when the U.S. government asks them to. China owns all these companies, and they toe the line and serve the state. There's not a separation here or a rule of law as we would see it. So China is looking to make headway in the Gulf, and it has done so. And there has been quite a pushback
from Washington here of looking to provide these states with other opportunities. I know we are slow on developing our own 5G, but there are other options out there. And I would hope that there is some continuity in the policy here, because China remains and has been defined by the NDAA as the main strategic challenge for the United States. And that requires countering them just not on a global basis, but in individual locations in the Middle East, country by country, fighting it out and pressing our interests and letting these countries know what it means to have this type of Chinese investment. In that regard, on to Israel. For years, I don't think Israel understood that China was one of these issues that could potentially become an irritant in the bilateral relationship. You saw during the Bush administration, when I was in the Pentagon, that the Israelis signed a contract to sell the Falcon, an advanced aerial early warning system to China. They had to cancel the deal with U.S. pressure, but they did move ahead on sales of the Harpies, that UAVs that changed across Strait balance with Taiwan. It was incredibly problematic. And, we had some very frank conversations with the Israelis, when I was with the secretary and during my time in government. And we saw that after a trip that I took with the secretary to Israel in May of 2020, that the Israelis subsequently canceled a contract with the Chinese to build their desalination plant. They, I think, are coming to a better understanding that this is going to be an issue not only for Republican administrations, but for Democratic administrations, for the U.S. government going forward. And they're going to have to look out for our strategic interests and make choices that reflect the nature of our close relationship. The United States government wasn't and isn't asking states to choose. They can do business with China, of course, but to give some thought to what they do. As for Haifa port, there's been much written about counterintelligence issues and concerns. I think this is overcomable, but there is a bigger issue about the mega infrastructure projects being done in that country or in any country by China, and whether there's going to be things inserted into these systems that can cause problems for allies and friends going forward. And I think we all have to give these investments a great deal of thought going forward.
One thing I would point out is that Israel never had China in its high-speed telecommunications, which put them at one point ahead of us since we did. But I guess it's a rebalancing of interests as time goes on. So we had a question from a listener about, not exactly about Jordan, but about Jordan. And that is the extradition of Ahlam al-Tamimi, who, for those of you who don't know, is a terrorist who is on the FBI's most wanted list of international terrorists. She was responsible for planning the Sbarro pizza bombing in Jerusalem years ago, in which an American citizen, a 14-year-old girl named Malki Roth, was killed. Somehow, although she is on the FBI's most wanted list, and there is an extradition treaty with Jordan, Ms. Tamimi is a television star in Amman, and she pops up everywhere. What's our position on trying to get her back or get her?
Well, this is a complicated issue. Let me say from the start that she's a killer, and she's just a horrific person, and I empathize, very much with the parents. My understanding is that she's not any longer on TV in Jordan, but listen, this is not going to be a popular point of view, but the original sin here is, of course, Israel. She was serving in an Israeli prison, and the Israelis extradited a killer of Americans to Jordan. That should not be done, to get back Gilad Shalit. Now, I understand she was one of a huge number of prisoners exchanged there, but the government of Israel should not be extraditing killers of Americans to countries, even if they have extradition treaties with the United States. That's number one. So Jordan says, as you know, that there is no extradition treaty. Now, it is true there is no extradition treaty, but the Jordanians did sign the initial letters to get this done, and the United States view the commitments toward extradition in force. This is a political hot potato for the Jordanians, who believe that not only is it that they don't have an extradition treaty, but believe that this would be double jeopardy. Of course, there is a separate charge that the United States has brought her up on, which is the weapons of mass destruction, use of a weapon of mass destruction. There are discussions with Jordan as the position of the United States government. It was in the last administration that George render her back to the United States. But once again, the kingdom, I think, views this as a lot of political sensitivities, and is certainly going to go through a bunch of hoops to have to do so. And my guess is that it will still take some time to get this done.
So you're not looking to have her here anytime in the near future?
Well, I don't think it'll happen very soon, no.
Thank you. Question. Given the blockage in the Suez Canal by the Ever Given, the ship, it took days and days and days to undo it, and it held up a lot of traffic, and it cost a lot of people a lot of money. Does the United States regard that as a potential avenue for terrorism, a way to close choke points? I realize that the ship was an accident, but do we regard that as potentially a choke point? And how are we doing looking at other such potential choke points, specifically at the bottom of the Red Sea, where the Houthis and the Iranians are, and it is only 18 miles wide down there?
Yeah.
And, by the way, Jordan's only access out, and it's Israel's big trading access out to the Indian Ocean.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and obviously the Suez Canal, a significant source of revenue. I think it provides a third of government revenues or something of that sort for the government of Egypt. Yeah, so it's obviously a choke point. Particularly important to the United States now that we are doing the pivot to Asia and doing force posture reassessments and realignments and bringing troops out of the Middle East. It's going to be increasingly important for the United States to be able to get troops and equipment to the region that aren't stationed there permanently. And that requires the use of the Suez Canal. And so this is a potential choke point. We saw before that, in the aftermath of the toppling of Mubarak, you had a group called Ansar Beit Maqdas, subsequently ISIS in the Sinai Peninsula, Wilayat Sina, that has tried to actually scuttle a ship in the Sinai. They fired an RPG that hit a ship going through the Suez Canal. So this is a significant threat. We not only rely on Egypt for short notice and frequent overflights to get our troops to the region back and forth and equipment, but we rely on the Suez Canal. There have been other options that have been suggested, including a high-speed rail or a rail line that goes from Haifa port to Aqaba or to Eilat. I don't think these are going to be an option anytime soon. But yeah, the Bab el-Mandeb, the access to the Gulf of Oman, et cetera, coming through the Red Sea is increasingly important. And the Houthis have increasing capabilities that can target ships in this area and beyond. There is, of course, as we already know, the Safar tanker, which is this ship that's 4 times the size of the Exxon Valdez, that is carrying, off the shore of Yemen, that is 40 years old and rotting, and is basically like a nuclear bomb that the Houthis have in their possession. They could, if something happened or were to become of this tanker, there would be an oil slick through the Red Sea that could prevent transportation through Bab el-Mandeb. So it's not only Houthi missiles, it's a potential ecological disaster that would cause a choke point, prevent ships from going through if you had an enormous oil slick. So yeah, it's something to think about, and some people should be thinking about. There's not a whole lot of other options right now, though.
A listener reminds us that the only U.S. military base, permanent base in Africa, is in Djibouti, which is just on the other side of the Red Sea from the Houthis and the Iranians. Yeah.
Yes.
Would you talk to us, speaking of Houthis and Iranians? I was going to try to keep this conversation on the north side, but I'm going to go to the south side. The Houthis have been shooting missiles, precision missiles. It's unlikely that they developed them themselves. It's more likely, as you have said, that these are Iranian missiles. Could you talk to us about the possibility that Iran is using Yemen as a test bed for weapons, and what that threat could be then both to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, to Israel, all kinds of Iranian enemies?
Yes, the Houthis are receiving advanced weaponry, missiles, UAVs from the Iranians. They've also developed quite an advanced indigenous production capability. And this poses dangers, as we've seen, ever since the Houthis were removed from the terrorism list, something that Secretary Pompeo designated them, I think, in the end of December of 2020. They were subsequently removed by the Biden administration, and the operational tempo of their attacks in Saudi Arabia has increased. Highly accurate, and they are doing sophisticated attacks against Saudi Arabia, and this has been going on for several years. But the bigger threat, as we've seen, potentially is to Israel. As we've seen, I think twice over the last 6 months, the Israelis have repositioned Patriot missiles to a lot. And, they're not there because they're worried about a missile being shot from South Africa. They're worried because that this is going to come from the Houthis. And so I think it's a very real concern and a very real threat. And this is once again part of Iran's efforts toward regional hegemony, where they have equipped this militia so well. They are so tied in with the IRGC and have such advanced capability, it's going to be really hard to roll it back. I think the Saudis over the past year and a half have shown great flexibility, have demonstrated that they are willing to negotiate in good faith to have a Yemen government that even includes the Houthis, or has a significant element of Houthi representation. But it is the Iranians and the Houthis that are not looking for a negotiated solution. They believe they can win this war militarily. And they're doing this, the Iranians, on the cheap. It doesn't cost much compared to, $1 million plus per Patriot missile to shoot these things down for the cost of a UAV that could potentially, to take out, kill a whole bunch of Saudi civilians, or eventually will kill one of the 100,000 Americans who are living in the kingdom.
That's not a happy thought. The Biden administration, staying where we were, has made it clear that it does not care for the government of Saudi Arabia, or at least doesn't care for certain policies of the government of Saudi Arabia. So a listener asks, is it possible that the Biden administration's policies, both on Iran and on Saudi Arabia, kind of liking one and less liking the other, will drive the Gulf countries closer to Israel, and rather than wrecking the Abraham Accords, actually make the relations on the southern side of Israel stronger?
Well, listen, just a word on the Biden administration policy on Saudi Arabia first. I think, notwithstanding some of the rhetoric, there was a lot of pressure from the sort of very, very far left of the party to break and to have a rift in the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. I think the Biden administration, to its credit, found an appropriate approach to this, which was to release a redacted version of the Khashoggi report, the same one that Gina Haspel had spoken about publicly, with the same assessment, to try and say, okay, we are going to hold them to account. We're going to sanction some initial individuals, but there is no smoking gun linking MBS to this via SIGINT or otherwise. And we're going to go after everybody that we have smoking gun. And I think this threads the needle and holds additional Saudis to account, and was the right thing to do. It's too important of a relationship to the United States to throw this out. And once again, I knew Jamal. I think what happened to him is horrific. And nevertheless, the relationships has to transcend that incident. So as for whether the administration's efforts to get a nuclear deal will push Israel closer to its ties with Gulf states, in particular, Emirates, Bahrain, maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe Oman, Qatar. Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think these states share a similar threat perception and know that they're going to have to work together. I would hope that the Biden administration engages with its friends, partners, allies in the Middle East to see how they perceive this and what they believe has to be integral in the deal or any deal going forward. But if not, these states are going to look after their own interests, and it just so happens that they overlap. So I do hope, and I do believe that it will push these states that already had so much in terms of shared economic interests, will push them together even closer, enable them to work strategically together.
Question: is there any hope for Syria?
Oof. So I don't see the Assad regime going anywhere. The Russian, the Iranian backing is very strong. Plus, you have a number of Arab states that are saying, as they would say in Arabic, "Khalas, enough is enough. We gotta end this war. We gotta bring Assad back into the Arab fold and have a little bit of stability here." Listen, Assad still doesn't control the country. He's still not going to get any funding for rebuilding the country. He's still not re-embraced in the Arab League. But it's not enough. There still is no significant chance that he is going to be toppled anytime soon, or even, I wouldn't hold out any hope of that really, unless it's somebody from his own family. I think the policy is right. I think he is a pariah. I don't think he can ever be accepted back into the international community. And yet, this administration, we'll see what their commitment is to staying in Syria. It's very important to deny Assad these oil revenues. It's very important to not allow him to retake the whole country. And we're doing so with very little American commitment, 800 troops, I believe. And it's working. And, also in a way enables Israel to do what their operations are ongoing, which is bombing the war between the wars, bombing Syrian, Iranian-backed weapon systems, et cetera there. I think this is an interim solution. It's not a full-time solution. We'll see if this administration appoints an envoy, but I think it's really intractable, and I think it's going to go on for some time.
Thank you. You mentioned funding for the Lebanese armed forces. Lebanese armed forces occasionally work for Hezbollah. They occasionally work for other people, but they get our money and they get our training. What's the upside and what's the downside of continuing that? Do we give them things that then go to Hezbollah?
No, we don't. I worked in when I worked in the Pentagon after Hariri was killed in 2005. We decided to give the LAF funding, and that was after the people of Lebanon rose up and kicked the Syrians out of Lebanon. At that point, we're giving them $70 million a year. It's slightly more than that now. Some of their officers do training in the United States. There is never, to my knowledge, any case where a weapon from the LAF ended up in the hands of Hezbollah. Now, maybe there are people that are going out and moonlighting, but Hezbollah does not need US weapons. Hezbollah has advanced weaponry of their own. They're well equipped. And there is an accounting. The LAF has to go back to the defense attaché and produce serial numbers when asked for of certain equipment. And so there is no leakage. In fact, the protection of American weapons by the LAF is among the best in the world. So that's not an issue. There has been collaboration in the past, some better reported than others, but this country is really on the verge of collapse. And if the LAF can provide some bit of public security, even if they are not doing anything and never will do anything about the disarming of Hezbollah, or on the border with Israel as opposed to Hezbollah, I still think it's worth it to have this type of insight and influence into the country. So I think it's money well spent. There are a lot of critics of the LAF, to be sure. We hammered them on some human rights issues in recent years, and that's warranted. Right now, they're going after a woman via court-martial in Akkar in northern Lebanon for appearing on an Israeli newscast. She was interviewed by somebody. This is not something that the Lebanese armed forces should be involved in, and it's likely to get congressional support to limit their funding. So I suggest that they just pay attention to getting their job done, which is hard enough.
So we're coming to the end of our program, and regular listeners know that my last question is always one designed to elicit a positive response from the guest. I don't think there's a lot of positive stuff out there for you, David. So I'm going to go with your last answer on the LAF and the reassurance that it is on balance the proper thing for the United States to be doing, and possibly a good thing for the people of Lebanon to have that force there and have it work with us. That's probably as optimistic as we're going to get today. So on behalf of the listeners, on behalf of the Jewish Policy Center, David Schenker, I want to thank you for a really informative program with us. Thank you, and I hope you'll come back again.
I will. Thank you, Shoshana. It was great to be with you.